Welcome to Wines We Drink, a podcast for wine lovers and learners. I'm Charlotte Norsworthy Varnum, and together with my counterpart Keith Herndon, we'll be exploring a new wine each week. Keith is a lover of wine, and I'm a learner of wine, and we hope you'll sip along with us. Hello, everyone. You have found the Wines We Drink podcast, and we are so happy you did. You are with us for our fourth episode in Season 5. I'm Charlotte Varnum, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Keith Herndon, a certified wine sommelier.
Charlotte, a big hello to you and a big welcome to you, our listeners. We're recording today in my wine kitchen, my happy place, right? And we just have an extraordinary wine selection to share with you today.
Listeners, if you are just joining us for this season, please let me fill you in on our approach for this summer. Keith's book, where I served as the editor, was published earlier this year, and we're using its content as the foundation for this season's shows.
Yes, we are, right? The book is entitled Wine Conversations, Exploring Meaning, Mystery, and Myth, and is a compilation of interviews I held with 16 amazing wine industry experts. You can get the book from Amazon, our local distributor, Neighborhood Books, or directly from the publisher. Links to order are on our homepage at wineswedrink.com. That's where you can also find a complete guide of all of our episodes across all of our seasons.
Today's episode is inspired by Keith's interview with Dr. Justine Vanden Heuvel, a professor in horticulture at Cornell University who specializes in viticulture research. She also teaches several courses, including the science of grapevines. Her passion for wine science certainly jumps off the page when you read your interview with her, and given her role at Cornell, it's not a surprise that she expressed her fondness for cool climate wines.
Let's listen to a brief clip from the interview that inspired today's wine selection. So, if you had to narrow it down and, describe your, favorite type of wine or style beyond saying cool climate, what's a go-to glass for you?
Oh, aromatic, cool climate, moderate acidity for sure. Dry, of course.
Charlotte, she's clear in what she likes in her glass, don't you think? A cool climate, dry wine that is aromatic with moderate acidity. Sounds good to me.
I would agree with that. That sounds great. And we found a perfect exemplar for her description today.
Yes, we have. And for some of our listeners, today's episodes may be a bit of a deja vu, because just as in last year's fourth episode, we're heading back to upstate New York and its amazing Finger Lakes region. Because when you're looking for a wine that fits Dr. Vanden Heuvel's description, you can't go wrong with a Riesling from this region.
I so remember last year's selection from the Finger Lakes. We featured a 2020 bottle from Ravines, which is a winery that expresses this varietal through a very dry, classical style.
Yes, and as we discussed last season, Rieslings can be sweet or semi-sweet, but the dry style is what is propelling the popularity of this varietal, and especially the popularity of wines from the Finger Lakes.
Well, and we're not simply repeating the same wine from last year as well, although I wouldn't object to that, to having another glass of that Ravines, but there are a lot of labels to choose from in the Finger Lakes.
Yeah, I learned that firsthand when my wife and I spent a week vacationing in the area 2 summers ago. There are actually 11 major lakes that make up the area known as the Finger Lakes. They were all left behind when, ancient glaciers receded. The area is simply beautiful. I mean, waterfalls everywhere. It makes for great scenery when you're hiking. But we're here to talk about wine, and we spent our fair share in the tasting rooms at Ravines, Barnstormer, Wagner, Hillick & Hobbs, Herman J. Wimmer, and of course, Dr. Constantine Frank, who is largely responsible for the wine industry in the area. I mean, his family now runs the business, but when he came there from Ukraine in the 1950s, he had to figure out how to translate his experience with cold climates into making wines in the harsh conditions of upstate New York.
Well, and I'm so glad he succeeded. Our wine palates thank him. So we need to let our listeners in on today's selection that fits the bill of aromatic and dry.
Well, it's also from the 2020 vintage, but this bottle is from the Hillick & Hobbs winery that sits on the eastern side of Seneca Lake, the biggest of the lakes that make up the Finger Lakes region. And yes, some of you with a bit of wine knowledge may recognize the name Hobbs. This winery is a passion project of the famous winemaker Paul Hobbs, who happened to grow up in this region.
So before we drink this wine, let's make sure everyone knows exactly who we're talking about. He is a legend, after all. Hobbs is the owner and vintner for 8 wineries around the world, including this one, but he's mostly known for the Paul Hobbs Winery in Napa and Viña Cobos in Argentina. He also has wineries in France and Spain, which has earned the nickname the Flying Winemaker. And so in 2013, Forbes magazine called him the Steve Jobs of wine. He's been named twice Wine Personality of the Year by the Wine Advocate. And his bio notes that across the portfolio, his wines have received more than 10 100-point scores. Wow.
Clearly, Paul Hobbs knows something about wine.
I would say.
And when he became serious about making a world-class Riesling, he was a big fan of that varietal that we kind of, a lot of us associate with Mosel, Germany, right? He decided to return to his roots here and founded Hillick & Hobbs in 2013, which, by the way, is named for his mother, Joan Hillick, and his father, Edward Hobbs. The estate now is about 75 acres with 25 of those acres in planted vineyards. We were there, and it's truly a beautiful location that rises steep above Seneca Lake.
Wow. I'm ready to return to the Finger Lakes, at least in my glass, and drink some dry Riesling again.
Sure. I'm going to pour us a couple of glasses. I got the cork out of there with no problem.
That's got to be good luck, right?
That's right.
So as he's pouring, some may be inclined to describe this, like other Rieslings, as a pale straw color, but that really seems to downplay what I'm seeing. It's really shimmery. It's glistening. So I'm going to go with pale gold as the color description, something a little more metallic, a little more shiny.
Shimmering in the glass is a good way to describe this Riesling. It's put on its best dress and it's ready for a night out on the town,
yes.
right? Elegant in the glass, so let's go in for that first smell.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the smell was emanating even before it got to my nose. Those floral notes are super prominent here. It's very aromatic.
I'm going to describe those floral notes as honeysuckle.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes.
A tasting note that I read refers to orchard blossom, and if I'm going to label that more specifically, I'm from Georgia. Mm-hmm. It's going to remind me of a peach orchard in fresh bloom.
That's a great comparison. And, that peach blossom aroma certainly sets up its flavor profile if we trust those tasting notes. Okay, they all talk about stone fruits, so let's go in for a sip and find out if that's true.
Right.
Oh, man.
Those tasting notes are on point.
Yep.
Yeah, those peach blossom notes turn into peach flavors on the palate. There's some pear along with it. And I'm going to add green apple there on the, the palate. The stone fruits are just abundant here.
I totally agree. But there's also some melon in there, perhaps, and spearmint notes.
Yeah, a little bit of a gum.
Right, yeah. A little bit of chewing gum there.
Spearmint gum, right.
It really continues to unfold, though, as you're taking that second and third sip.
Right. I may have my fourth sip here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It continues to unravel, really, as you keep going.
It surprises, really, with a juicy citrus finish. Mm-hmm. It does have acid, right? Mm-hmm. But the winemaker calls it, quote, structured acidity, unquote, which I think is another way of saying that it's not overpowering.
Right, that's exactly right. I mean, it's present and then it swiftly moves on its way. It's a refreshing wine and you're left with a really juicy finish, like you were saying. But even still, there's some complexities at work here that elevate that style, I think. When I think of a dry Riesling, I would immediately think light body, at the most maybe medium body. But in reading the tasting notes, I saw where the reviewers at jamessuckling.com called this a full-bodied style, layered and structured. So there's that word again.
Yes, you have to dig into the production notes a bit to see how this wine was created as a full-bodied white wine. First the grapes were pressed whole cluster. Those stems are going to contribute some vegetal quality to the wine. Secondly, the wine underwent a a native malolactic fermentation, which means bacteria was allowed to convert the wine's malic acid into lactic acid. It's the same as in milk, which contributes a bit of that creaminess to the texture. Finally, the notes tell us that it aged in stainless steel tanks before bottling. The grapes were harvested in October 2020, but the wine wasn't bottled until August 2021. So that's about 10 months of aging. Right?
Well, and yeah, that does help explain how we got to what's in this wonderful bottle.
It's a combination of nature and the craftsmanship of the winery. The result is a dry Riesling. This one only has about 5 grams of residual sugar, and it's 13% alcohol by volume.
Wow.
It checks those boxes that Dr. Vanden Heuvel likes in her cool climate wines.
So how much does this bottle of Hillick and Hobbs typically sell for?
Well, Charlotte, the Vivino apps list this vintage as well as some of the more recent vintages as retailing for an average price of about $35 a bottle.
Okay.
Right? The app rated this vintage as 4.2 out of 5 stars and said it rates better than any of the other years for this wine. Right? That placed it among the top 2% of all the wines in the world according to the Vivino scoring. That's a crowdsourced rating that we've talked about on this show a lot. But not only does the crowd like this wine, the professional reviewers like it as well. Wine Enthusiast gave it 96 points.
Wow.
James Suckling awarded it 94 points, and Decanter magazine gave it 91 points.
Wow. I mean, those are incredible scores. But this vintage is approaching 5 years from its harvest. So what if our listeners can't find a 2020?
Well, there's still some of the 2020 in the retail channels, and you don't have to worry about its drinkability. The complex structure of this wine and its good acidity will keep this vintage in good shape for at least another 5 years or so.
Wow.
But to answer your question directly, you can't go wrong with a more recent vintage from Hillick and Hobbs. Also, the 2022 earned the same scores from the professional reviewers, and I had a chance to sample the 2023 vintage. It was fantastic. It felt a little bit lighter on the palate. Perhaps that's because its alcohol by volume was slightly lower at 12%.
That's so interesting how the vintages can take different shapes but still present a really reliable and reliably tasty product at that. So, listeners, find a Hillick and Hobbs dry Riesling from any vintage. You can't go wrong. And while $35 may be a bit pricey for some of you, think of this as maybe an entryway into your elevated wine experience. A good foray.
Yeah, I like that approach. And this is a good time to remind our listeners that the wines we feature on the show are always wines we drink. That's why we call the show Wines We Drink. As our title says, we don't feature any promotional wines and we don't take any money for wine or wine trips. We're not paid influencers.
Yes, we're independent and our palates are our guides. So let's explore how we would pair today's wine with food. In thinking about today's wine, I did a bit of homework, right, on the pairings. And it would work really nicely with a range of Asian dishes. And it would also really go well with some grilled seafood, shellfish. But I have a dish in mind that may be a bit surprising for this wine.
Okay, let's put you back in the role of Chef Charlotte. What surprise do you have for us?
Well, I think you could pair this nicely with a roasted pork loin. Okay, remember this isn't a flat, light-bodied wine. It has structure to it. It's some layered complexity in its flavors. And the acidity will cut through the pork's richness, cleansing the palate, while those stone fruits and mineral notes create some sense of harmony there.
Yeah, I'm sold. You could even add an applesauce glaze to the pork loin to pick up some of the stone fruit connection.
Yeah,
there, right?
That would be a great touch. So now let's talk about a cheese pairing. I always got to talk cheese.
Yes, absolutely. I'm not going to deviate too far from last year's suggested pairing when we featured a creamy camembert, right? This year, my suggestion is that, I guess we call that the cheese cousin, right?
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Brie. I have some brie here for us to sample. It's a soft cheese. This is a buttery and mild, and I think it works really well with the juicy acidity that we're going to get from the wine. There's some bites of brie here, so let's go for it.
Let's get into it for sure. Oh yeah, the creamy, smooth texture of the brie is what works so well here. The flavors work together as well, but it's the texture that I like with the wine.
Yeah. Let's enjoy a few more bites of Brie and Riesling as we use this opportunity to take a short break.
Good idea. Listeners, we'll be back in a moment with the finish. Keith is going to share a few more insights from his interview with Justine Vanden Heuvel. Hello again, everyone. Thanks for joining us during the segment that we call The Finish. This is where we bring the show to a close with some additional insight about today's wine conversation. Today, we want to talk about the issue of sustainability in grape growing.
As we said from the outset, today's episode is inspired by my interview with Dr. Justine Vanden Heuvel, a Cornell University horticulture professor who specializes in viticulture. Here's a brief clip from that interview, which we feature in the book Wine Conversations, Exploring Meaning, Mystery, and Myth.
Well, the goal of my program is to improve the environmental sustainability of wine grape production without increasing the economic cost.
Well, it's important to note that we took her notion of sustainability to heart when selecting the wine we featured on today's show.
Yeah, absolutely. The Hillican Hobbs Winery at Seneca Lake is certified under the New York Sustainable Wine Growing Program. Certification within that program is based on science-backed, regionally defined standards, and the wineries that display that seal must undergo some rigorous independent third-party audits.
I mean, it really seems like a rigorous program, but Dr. Vanden Heuvel noted a shortcoming with such programs.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if it's actually a shortcoming of the programs themselves or just the fact that all of this is confusing to consumers, right? She pointed out that for consumers to truly understand what the certifications mean, they would have to look up the standards for themselves and then understand, different vineyard practices, which she knows is very difficult. But on the other hand, she did express a lot of enthusiasm for programs that work at the regional level to create sustainability standards rather than, as she put it, quote, just trying to apply a blanket national organic program to vineyards regardless of their geographic location, end quote. Right?
I also liked her stance about not adhering to an organic practice simply for the sake of maintaining a certification. Sometimes it's more complicated than what we as consumers may even realize.
Yes, in the book, she tells about how she felt compelled to pull the organic certification from one of her vineyards at Cornell when it became infected with black rot. She said her only option with the organic certification would have been to treat with copper, but spraying more copper on those vines would have dripped down into the soil and persisted there over time in ways that would have negatively impacted the vineyard, right?
Right, and so therefore her overall point was that the industry needs to think more critically about what is done in the vineyards rather than blindly following standards, especially if they've not been modified for regional differences.
I came away from my conversation with her more convinced than ever that funding and supporting dedicated scientists like her it's the only way forward, right? I found her to be extremely sincere in that her research is about finding solutions. After all, she concluded the interview by saying this, quote, "If grape growers are not interested in my research and or are not going to adopt the practices my team is studying, then I am asking the wrong questions with my research," end quote.
I mean, that's powerful stuff, right? She really sees it as application and practical movement with her research. It's admirable. Keith, thanks for featuring another great expert in your book and using her comments to inspire today's episode. I really thoroughly enjoyed our return visit to the Finger Lakes. Would you be able to give us a preview on where we're going next week?
Well, next week we're headed back to California's Napa Valley. My conversation is with one of the region's pioneering women winemakers, and it led to next week's selection of her iconic Chardonnay. And Chef Charlotte will be back to match it with a perfect pairing.
Iconic wine, perfect pairing, we hope. No pressure there. Thanks for joining us today, and please join us for next week's show. I'll give it the old college try, everybody. Yep. Cheers, everyone.
Yeah, cheers.
Thanks for listening to Wines We Drink. Listen to our other episodes anywhere you get your podcasts, and be sure to follow us on Instagram at The Wines We Drink, and check out our episode guides at wineswedrink.com. Cheers.